The dust hadn't settled from the last stagecoach when Cassandra Black Cat Murphy rode into Perdition Creek, her mare's hooves striking the hard-packed earth with the deliberate rhythm of a funeral march. The town sprawled before her like a wounded animal, all weathered wood and broken dreams, its main street scarred by wheel ruts and the darker stains that spoke of blood spilled and never properly cleaned. She'd been riding hard for 3 days, following the telegraph lines and the stories that traveled faster than any horse. Stories of a man named Ezekiel Thorne who'd set himself up as judge, jury, and executioner in this God-forsaken corner of Arizona territory. Stories of good folk ground under his boot heel while the law looked the other way, their pockets lined with Thorne's silver. Cassie pulled her black hat low over green eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. At 32, she carried herself with the fluid grace of a woman who'd learned early that survival meant being faster with her gun than most men were with their prayers. The bounty hunters called her Black Cat for the way she moved in darkness and for the luck that seemed to follow her, though whether it was good luck or bad depended entirely on which side of her Colt 45 you found yourself. The town's single saloon squatted at the street's end like a toad. Through the grimy windows, she could see the orange glow of oil lamps and the shadows of men who'd learned to drink their troubles into submission. But it was the building next to it that caught her attention, a whitewashed structure that might have been a church once, before someone had hammered a crude sign over the door, Thorne Justice Company. A woman emerged from the general store, her calico dress faded but clean, a small boy clutching her skirts. The child couldn't have been more than 6, but his eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd seen his world torn apart. As they passed beneath a street lamp, Cassie saw the purpling bruise that spread across the woman's jaw like spilled ink. "You'd be wise to keep riding, miss." The voice came from the shadows beside the saloon. An old man stepped into the lamplight, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once carried more meat. His left arm ended at the wrist, wrapped in a clean bandage that spoke of recent injury. "Would I now?" Cassie's voice carried the soft drawl of Oklahoma, but there was steel underneath the velvet. "And what makes you think I'm the sort to take wise advice?" The old man's eyes flicked to the twin Colts at her hips, then to the Winchester rifle in her saddle scabbard. "Because you got the look of someone who's tired of running, and Thorne's got 20 men who'll put you in the ground before you can clear leather." 20 men? Cassie dismounted, her boots hitting the dirt with barely a sound. "That all? Hell, I was expecting a challenge." Before the old man could respond, the bat-wing doors of the saloon crashed open. 4 men stumbled out, their spurs jangling like broken wind chimes. They wore the arrogant swagger of men who'd grown used to being feared, their gun belts slung low and their hats tilted at angles that suggested they thought themselves quite the desperados. The largest of them, a bear of a man with arms like tree trunks, spotted Cassie and grinned. Several teeth were missing, and the rest were stained brown with tobacco juice. "Well, looky here, boys, we got ourselves a visitor." His voice was thick with whiskey and malice. "Pretty little thing, ain't she? Bet she'd clean up real nice." Cassie let her hand rest easy near her gun, her posture relaxed but ready. She'd learned long ago that men like these mistook patience for weakness, right up until the moment they found themselves staring down her barrel. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her tone conversational. "Lovely night for a ride. I don't suppose any of you fine fellows could direct me to the local law." The 4 men exchanged glances and burst into laughter. The big one slapped his thigh with enough force to raise dust from his pants. "Law! Hell, lady, you're looking at it. We're Mr. Thorne's deputies, duly sworn and authorized to keep the peace in Perdition Creek." He hooked his thumbs in his gun belt and rocked back on his heels. "And right now, you're disturbing that peace." "Am I now?" Cassie's voice remained steady, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Well, I surely do apologize. Perhaps you could explain to me what constitutes disturbing the peace in your fair town." "Riding in after dark with iron on your hip," said another of the men, this one thin as a whip and twice as mean-looking. "Could be you're fixing to cause trouble." "Could be I'm fixing to prevent it." Cassie took a step forward, and all four men tensed. "See, I heard tell there's been some unpleasantness hereabouts. Folk getting hurt who don't deserve it. Property being taken from people who worked honest to earn it. That sort of thing tends to rile me up something fierce." The big man's hand dropped to his gun. "You know what, boys? I think this here's one of them troublemaking women we been warned about. The kind that comes riding in, thinking she can tell decent folk how to live their lives." "Decent folk." Cassie repeated the words like she was tasting something sour. "Is that what you call yourselves?" The tension in the street stretched tight as a bowstring. The old man had melted back into the shadows, and even the usual night sounds seemed to have gone quiet, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Then the woman in calico appeared at the edge of the lamplight, her boy still clinging to her skirts. She looked at Cassie with eyes that held a desperate kind of hope, the same look Cassie had seen in her own mirror more times than she cared to remember. "Please," the woman whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. "Just, please, don't make it worse." The words hit Cassie like a physical blow. She'd heard them before, in a dozen different towns, from 100 different throats. Always the same plea from people who'd been beaten down so far they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "What's your name, ma'am?" Cassie asked, never taking her eyes off the four men. Sarah Kellerman." "Well, Sarah Kellerman, I want you to take your boy and go on home now. Lock your door and keep your head down until morning. Can you do that for me?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded and hurried away, practically carrying the child in her haste to escape. The big man laughed again, but this time there was less humor in it. "Real touchin', lady, but you still ain't answered my question about what brings you to our town." Cassie's smile was sharp as a knife edge. "Justice, boys. I came looking for justice." "Justice?" The thin man spat into the dirt. "Hell, you're looking at it. Mr. Thorne dispenses all the justice this town needs." "Is that a fact?" Cassie's hand moved closer to her gun. "And what sort of justice did he dispense to earn Mrs. Kellerman that bruise on her face? What sort of justice cost that old fellow his hand?" The big man's eyes narrowed. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who ain't from around here." "I ask the right questions, and I've got a feeling I'm not going to like the answers." Cassie took another step forward, and this time her hand settled on her gun butt. "See, I've got this peculiar habit of sticking my nose into other folks' business when that business involves hurting people who can't fight back. Lady, you got about 10 seconds to climb back on that horse and ride out of town, or we're gonna have ourselves a problem." Cassie's laugh was soft and dangerous. "Boys, we already got ourselves a problem. The only question now is whether you're smart enough to walk away from it." The four men spread out, forming a rough semicircle around her. Their hands hovered near their weapons, but Cassie could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They were used to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers, not someone who looked like she knew which end of a gun the bullets came out of. "Last chance," the big man said. "Ride out or we'll carry you out." Cassie sighed and shook her head. "You know, I really hoped y'all would be smarter than this. I truly did." Her draw was faster than a lightning strike. The Colt seemed to appear in her hand as if by magic, its barrel pointing steadily at the big man's chest before any of them had cleared leather. "Now then," she said, conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather, "I believe we were having a conversation about justice. Why don't you boys just ease those hands away from your guns and tell me where I might find Mr. Thorne?" The four men stood frozen, their faces pale in the lamplight. The big man's gun was halfway out of its holster, but he didn't dare complete the draw. "You can't take all four of us," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not," Cassie admitted, "but I guarantee you won't be around to see which ones I miss. Now, about Mr. Thorne." Before anyone could answer, a new voice cut through the night air like a whip crack. "That will be quite enough." The man who stepped out of the Thorne Justice Company building was tall and lean, dressed in a black suit that had been tailored to fit his angular frame perfectly. His silver hair was slicked back with pomade, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a snake deciding whether to strike. Despite the late hour, he looked as fresh as if he'd just stepped out of a barber shop. Ezekiel Thorne moved with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no and lived to remember it. "Gentlemen," he said to his four men, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an Eastern education, "I believe you're embarrassing yourselves. 4 grown men, held at bay by a single woman. What will people say?" The big man's face flushed red. "Mr. Thorne, she drew on us faster than you could think, evidently." Thorne's gaze shifted to Cassie, and she felt the weight of his attention like ice water down her spine. "And you, my dear, must be the infamous Black Cat Murphy. Your reputation precedes you." Cassie kept her gun trained on the 4 men, but spoke to Thorne. "Funny thing about reputations, they tend to grow in the telling. Most of what you've heard is probably nonsense." "Oh, I doubt that very much." Thorne clasped his hands behind his back, the picture of civilized authority. 8 banks robbed across 3 territories. 12 men killed in fair fights. The mysterious disappearance of Judge Carlton Hayes after he sentenced that widow and her children to hang for stealing a pig they needed to survive. His smile was thin as paper. Quite an impressive resume for someone who claims to be nonsense. The mention of Judge Hayes sent a chill through Cassie's heart, but she kept her expression neutral. That particular piece of business had been personal and permanent. "Sounds like you've been doing your homework, Mr. Thorne. I'm flattered." "Knowledge is power, Miss Murphy, and power is what separates civilized men from the beasts of the field." Thorne took a step closer, apparently unconcerned by the gun in her hand. "The question is, what brings you to my town? Surely not coincidence." "Your town?" Cassie raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. I was under the impression this was still part of the United States of America. When did you buy it from the government?" Thorne's laugh was like breaking glass. "The government, my dear, is 1,000 miles away. Out here, in the real world, power belongs to those strong enough to take it and smart enough to keep it. I provide order where there was chaos, protection where there was vulnerability, justice where there was only the law of the gun." Justice. Cassie tasted the word again. "That's what you call it when you beat a woman for not paying taxes she can't afford? When you cut off an old man's hand for speaking against you?" "Discipline, Miss Murphy. Swift, certain, and final. These people understand nothing else. Thorn's voice carried the fervor of a true believer. Before I came to Perdition Creek, this was a dying town. Drunks and failures eking out a miserable existence in the desert. Now look at it. Clean, orderly, productive.
Terrified.
Respectful, Thorn corrected. There's a difference. Cassie glanced around at the empty street, the shuttered windows, the shadows that seemed to hold watching eyes.
Where I come from, we call that fear.
Then you come from a place that values chaos over order. Thorn's patience seemed to be wearing thin. But we digress. You still haven't told me why you're here.
Maybe I just don't like bullies.
How refreshingly naive. The world is full of bullies, Miss Murphy. The strong prey upon the weak. It's the natural order of things. I simply do it more efficiently than most. The 4 deputies were still frozen in their half-draws, sweat beading on their foreheads despite the cool desert air. Cassie could see the calculation in their eyes, the desperate desire to please their boss warring with the very real fear of her gun.
The natural order?
Cassie mused. You know, I met a man once who said something similar. Called himself Colonel during the war, though I suspect his commission came from a whiskey bottle rather than the War Department. He had a whole philosophy about the strong and the weak, the hunters and the prey. A wise man, evidently. A dead man, Cassie corrected. Turns out his philosophy had a flaw in it. He forgot that sometimes the prey decides to bite back. Thorn's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Are you threatening me, Miss Murphy? Am educating you, Mr. Thorn. See, I've been riding through your territory for the past week, talking to people, listening to stories, learning about the kind of justice you dispense. Her voice hardened. Did you know there's a family called the Hendersons about 20 miles south of here? Nice folks, had a small spread, raised cattle, minded their own business. Past tense, Mr. Thorn. Care to guess why? For the first time, Thorn's composure cracked slightly. The Hendersons were harboring rustlers. Justice was served. The Hendersons were harboring their 14-year-old nephew, whose only crime was asking questions about what happened to his father's mining claim. The same mining claim that now flies your flag. Cassie's gun never wavered, but her other hand moved to rest on her second Colt. 5 people dead, Mr. Thorn, including a woman who was expecting her first child. The temperature in the street seemed to drop 10 degrees. Even Thorn's 4 men looked uncomfortable now, shifting from foot to foot like children caught stealing from the cookie jar. You're well-informed, Thorn said finally, but incomplete in your understanding. The Hendersons were murdered, Cassie cut him off. Just like the Kellermans will be murdered if Sarah's husband keeps asking questions about his brother's disappearance. Just like that old man will be killed if he grows back his tongue along with his missing hand. You seem to have appointed yourself judge and jury, Miss Murphy. No, Mr. Thorn, I've appointed myself executioner. The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Thorn's 4 men took an involuntary step back, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple confrontation. My, Thorn said softly, such dramatics. Tell me, Miss Murphy, what makes you any different from me? We both take what we want. We both kill those who stand in our way. The only difference is that I'm honest about it. The difference, Cassie said, is that I kill people who deserve it. And who decides what people deserve? You? Based on what authority? What divine mandate grants you the right to decide who lives and who dies? The question hit closer to home than Cassie cared to admit. She'd asked herself the same thing 100 times, usually in the dark hours before dawn, when the ghosts of the men she'd killed came calling. But looking at this town, at the fear in Sarah Kellerman's eyes, at the missing hand of an old man whose only crime was speaking truth to power, she found her answer. The same authority that lets you cut off hands and murder families. The difference is, I use mine to protect people instead of terrorizing them. How delightfully simple your world must be, Miss Murphy. Good and evil, black and white, with no shades of gray to complicate the picture. Thorne began walking slowly in a circle around her, like a vulture sizing up carrion. But what happens when you're gone? When Black Cat Murphy rides off into the sunset, having dispensed her rough justice? Who protects these people then? They protect themselves, the way free people always have. Free people? Thorne's laugh was genuinely amused now. Freedom is a luxury, Miss Murphy. These people can't afford luxury. They need structure. They need someone to make the hard decisions for them, to shoulder the burden of command. They need you dead. The words came from an unexpected source. Sarah Kellerman stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the street, her boy beside her. She no longer looked like the frightened woman who'd pleaded for peace. Her spine was straight, her chin raised, and in her hands was an old shotgun that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. "Sarah," Thorne said, his voice taking on a paternal tone, "you should be home with your child. This is no place for decent women." "Decent women," Sarah repeated, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear. "Like my sister-in-law was decent? Like the Henderson woman was decent? How many more decent women have to die before someone stands up to you?" Other figures began emerging from doorways and alleys. Men and women who'd been hiding in their homes, afraid to show their faces, suddenly drawn by the sound of defiance. They came armed with whatever they could find: hunting rifles, kitchen knives, farm tools. An army of the desperate and the dispossessed. The old man with the missing hand stepped up beside Sarah, a Colt Navy revolver in his remaining fist. 20 years I've lived in this town," he said, his voice carrying across the silent street. 20 years of watching it grow, watching families build something good here. And you destroyed it all in 6 months. "Thomas," Thorne said, his voice sharp with command, "you're making a mistake. All of you are. Go home, lock your doors, pretend this never happened, and we'll speak no more of it." But Thomas wasn't backing down. Neither was Sarah, or the dozen other townspeople who'd found their courage in the presence of someone willing to stand against the tyrant. "No more," Sarah said simply. "No more running, no more hiding, no more watching you murder good people and calling it justice." Thorne's 4 deputies were looking around nervously now, realizing that the odds had shifted dramatically. They were no longer 4 against 1. They were 4 against an entire town that had finally remembered what it felt like to be free. "Miss Murphy," Thorne said, his voice still conversational, but with an edge that could cut glass. "I believe you've started something you can't finish. These people will die because of your interference. Their blood will be on your hands." Cassie looked around at the faces surrounding her. Fear was still there, but it was no longer the only emotion in their eyes. There was hope now, too, and determination, and something that might have been pride. "Maybe," she said, "but at least they'll die as free men and women. That's more than they've been living as." Thorne nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. "Very well, Miss Murphy. You've made your choice. Now we'll see if you can live with the consequences." He turned and walked back toward his building, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. At the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Gentlemen," he said to his 4 deputies, "kill them all." The street erupted into chaos. Thorne's 4 men went for their guns with the desperate fury of trapped animals, but they were too slow and too panicked. Cassie's second Colt appeared in her left hand as if by magic, and both weapons spoke in perfect synchronization. The big man spun around and crashed through the saloon's batwing doors, while his thin companion crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The other 2 deputies managed to clear leather, but the townspeople were ready for him. Thomas's Navy Colt boomed like thunder, and one of them doubled over, clutching his gut. Sarah's shotgun roared, the blast taking the last man off his feet and sending him sliding through the dirt. The entire gunfight lasted less than 10 seconds, but in that brief span of time, everything in Perdition Creek changed forever. Cassie spun towards Thorne's building, both guns trained on the doorway, but the man himself had vanished. Through the windows, she could see movement in the shadows, more men, armed and ready. The real fight was just beginning. "How many more?" she called out to Thomas. 16, maybe 18, the old man replied, ejecting spent shells from his revolver with practiced efficiency. "All hard men, all killers." "Then we'd better make sure we kill 'em first." Cassie looked around at the townspeople, seeing the mixture of triumph and terror in their faces. They'd tasted victory, but they knew it was just the appetizer to a much bloodier main course. "Anyone who wants to leave, do it now. This is going to get ugly." Nobody moved. Sarah reloaded her shotgun with shells from her dress pocket. Thomas snapped his cylinder closed with a definitive click. A dozen other men and women checked their weapons and waited for whatever came next. "Well then," Cassie said, surprised by the fierce pride that swelled in her chest, "let's go collect us some justice." The next few minutes were a deadly game of cat and mouse. Thorne's men began emerging from buildings all along the street, using doorways and windows for cover while they tried to get clean shots at the townspeople. But these weren't the soft targets they were used to terrorizing. These were farmers and ranchers, people who'd grown up hunting game and fighting off rustlers. They knew how to shoot, and more importantly, they knew how to take cover. Cassie moved through the chaos like a wraith, her black duster flowing behind her as she darted from shadow to shadow. Her guns spoke with mechanical precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. She'd learned long ago that in a fight like this, there was no room for mercy or hesitation. Every enemy left standing was another chance for an innocent person to die. A rifle cracked from the general store's second floor, and Thomas staggered, blood spreading across his shirt. Cassie put 2 rounds through the window before the shooter could work his bolt, and the rifle tumbled to the street below. "Thomas!" Sarah dropped beside the old man, pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder. "You crazy old fool!" "Takes one to know one," Thomas gasped, but his eyes were still alert and angry. "Help me up! I ain't finished with these bastards yet." The battle raged up and down the main street, a running firefight between people who'd found their courage and the hired killers who'd been bleeding them dry. Cassie lost count of how many men she'd put down, but she could see the tide turning. Thorne's forces were dwindling, their arrogance replaced by the desperate fury of predators suddenly finding themselves prey. But Thorne himself remained elusive, appearing at windows and doorways just long enough to fire a few shots before vanishing again. He was saving himself for the final confrontation, and Cassie knew it was coming. She found him where she'd expected to, in his own building. The former church had corrupted into a monument to his twisted version of justice. The interior still showed traces of its holy origins: stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Bible, carved wooden pews that had been rearranged to face a massive oak desk instead of an altar. But the walls were covered with wanted posters, legal documents, and the tools of Thorne's trade: whips, chains, and instruments of torture that had no place in any civilized courtroom. Thorne sat behind his desk, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a Colt Dragoon in the other. He'd shed his black jacket, and his white shirt was stained with sweat and gun smoke, but his pale eyes were as cold and calculating as ever. "Miss Murphy," he said, raising his glass in a mocking toast, "I must congratulate you on your tactics, turning my own subjects against me. Quite brilliant, really. I should have anticipated it." "Your subjects?" Cassie kept both guns trained on him, though she noticed he hadn't raised his weapon yet. "That's your problem, Thorne. You think people are things to be owned, aren't they?" He took a sip of whiskey, savoring it like a man enjoying his last drink. "Look at them out there, Miss Murphy, fighting and dying over concepts they barely understand. Freedom, justice, democracy. Pretty words that mean nothing when the bullets start flying. They mean everything when the bullets start flying. That's when you find out what people are really made of." "And what are you made of, I wonder?" Thorne leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. What drives the infamous Black Cat Murphy? What trauma turned a woman into a killer? The question hit home, but Cassie didn't let it show. "Maybe I just don't like seeing good people get hurt." How wonderfully altruistic. But we both know that's not the whole truth, don't we? Thorne's smile was sharp as a razor. "You're not a savior, Miss Murphy. You're a predator, just like me. The only difference is that you've convinced yourself you're hunting for noble reasons. The difference is that I'm hunting you." "Yes, you are. And do you know why?" Thorne set down his glass and leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious intelligence. "Because I remind you of someone. Someone who hurt you badly long ago. Someone you couldn't stop then, but you think you can stop now by killing me." Cassie felt something cold settle in her stomach. The man was too close to the truth for comfort. "Every person you've killed," Thorne continued relentlessly. "Every bank you've robbed. Every corrupt official you've disappeared. It's all been practice for this moment. You've been preparing your whole life to face me, haven't you? I've been preparing my whole life to face men like you," Cassie admitted. "Men who think power gives them the right to hurt innocent people. Men who mistake fear for respect and cruelty for strength. Men like your father." The words hit Cassie like a physical blow. For a moment, the church seemed to spin around her, and she was 12 years old again, watching her mother's blood pool on the kitchen floor, while the man who'd sired her stood over the body with a whiskey bottle in one hand and a belt in the other. "You don't know anything about my father," she said, but her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I know enough." Thorne's voice was soft now, almost gentle. "I know he was a drunk and a brute. I know he killed your mother in one of his rages. I know you ran away that night and never looked back. And I know that every time you look at me, you see his face." Cassie's hands were shaking now, though whether from rage or grief she couldn't tell. "Shut up. But here's the beautiful irony, Miss Murphy. In trying to escape your father's legacy, you've become exactly like him. A killer. A wanderer with no home and no peace. The only difference is that you tell yourself pretty stories about justice and protecting the innocent." "I said, shut up!" Cassie's voice cracked like a whip, and both guns swung toward Thorne's chest. But the man just smiled. "Pull those triggers, Miss Murphy. Prove to yourself that you're different from the man who made you. Kill me, and then ride on to the next town, the next tyrant, the next chance to replay the same scene over and over until someone finally puts a bullet in your back. At least I'll die knowing I made a difference. Will you?" Thorne's dragoon came up fast, but Cassie was faster. Her right-hand Colt spoke first, the heavy slug punching through Thorne's chest and slamming him back into his chair. But even as he died, his finger tightened on the trigger. The dragoon's roar filled the small space like thunder, and Cassie felt fire lance through her left side. She stumbled, her second gun clattering to the floor as she pressed a hand against the wound. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm and sticky. Thorne slumped forward over his desk, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at nothing. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, staining his white shirt crimson. "The difference," Cassie whispered to his corpse, "is that I know when to stop." She holstered her remaining gun and walked unsteadily to the door. Outside, the shooting had stopped. The surviving members of Thorne's gang were either dead or fled, and the townspeople were beginning to emerge from cover, blinking in the lamplight like people waking from a nightmare. Sarah Kellerman was the first to see her. The woman ran across the street, her boy close behind, and caught Cassie as she staggered. "You're hurt," Sarah said, her voice tight with concern. "I've been worse," Cassie lied. The bullet had cracked at least one rib, and every breath sent fresh pain lancing through her side. But she was alive, and Thorne wasn't, and sometimes that was the best you could hope for. "Is he dead?" Thomas asked, limping up with his arm in a makeshift sling. "He's dead," Cassie confirmed. "It's over." The townspeople began to cheer, a ragged sound that mixed triumph with exhaustion. They embraced each other, laughed, cried, and generally acted like people who just remembered what freedom felt like. But Cassie found herself thinking about Thorne's final words. Was he right? Was she just a killer with a conscience, doomed to repeat the same violent cycle until someone finally ended it for her? "What will you do now?" Sarah asked as she helped Cassie to a chair outside the general store. Cassie looked around at the faces surrounding her. These people had found their courage tonight, but courage alone wouldn't be enough to rebuild their lives. They'd need leaders, law, institutions that could provide justice without becoming tyranny. "I reckon I'll stick around for a while," she said finally. "Make sure you folks get back on your feet properly. Send some telegrams to Santa Fe. See about getting you a real sheriff and a real judge." "And after that?" Cassie smiled, though it hurt her ribs. "After that, well, see. Maybe it's time Black Cat Murphy learned how to be just Cassie again. Maybe it's time I stopped running from my father's ghost and started building something instead of just tearing things down." She looked up at the stars scattered across the desert sky like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere out there, other towns were suffering under other tyrants. Other families were living in fear, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to stand up for them. But tonight, Perdition Creek was free. Tonight, good people could sleep without fear. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Maybe she'd finally done something that would have made her mother proud, instead of just continuing the cycle of violence that had started in a bloody kitchen 20 years ago. The desert wind picked up, stirring the dust and carrying away the acrid smell of gun smoke. In the distance, a coyote howled, a wild and lonely sound that seemed to echo the freedom that had been won at such a high cost. Cassie closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her own breathing, steady and strong despite the wound in her side. She was alive. The good people were safe. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The woman outlaw who'd finally had enough of seeing good folks suffer under a tyrant's lash had found something worth more than any bank robbery or reputation. She'd found a place where she could make a difference. And maybe, if she was very lucky, a place where she could finally make peace with the ghosts that had been riding with her all these years. As the celebration continued around her, Cassie Murphy, no longer quite so black, no longer quite so much of a cat, allowed herself to smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve. But tonight, justice had been served, and that was enough to chase away the demons, at least for a while. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small human drama that had played out beneath them. But in Perdition Creek, freedom had been reborn. And sometimes that was all the universe needed to offer. A chance for good people to stand up, fight back, and reclaim their right to live without fear. Cassie pulled her black hat down over her eyes and settled back in the chair, content for once to be still, to be safe, and to be exactly where she belonged.